The hydraulic fracturing boom is sweeping the nation and could be coming to your neighborhood. We'll talk with a climate scientist, an energy industry professional, a conservationist, and a farmer on fracking in California. Also in this hour, we'll sit down with experts to drill into the impacts of fracking in the U.S. First, we'll talk with two of the nation's leading fracking journalists to extract the facts behind fracking. Up next on Climate One.
How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg DALTON gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
David Baker, let's begin with you. Describe for us the shale boom and what it's doing to the energy landscape in America.
It's doing a couple of things, and it's the most profound revolution that we've had in energy outside of the renewable stuff that's coming online. The most profound revolution we've had in decades. It has unlocked natural gas supplies that in the past we just couldn't get to. And more recently, it's unlocking oil supplies that were known for a long time but have just been not economical to produce. And so suddenly, the dynamics and the politics of energy have been really upended within the last 5 or 6 years because we've got bigger supplies of these things than we thought just 5, 6, 7 years ago.
And the upside of it is that it's domestic, it's supposedly cleaner than coal, and it's cheaper. So it's cheaper, cleaner, sounds like a pretty good deal.
I think that remains to be seen.
What are the possible downsides to natural gas?
Well, there's the risk of water contamination we've all heard a lot about. Anecdotally, if you travel to, which I've done, the places where drilling has happened across the country, there are stories, complaints of serious environmental problems having to do with water risk, people's water taps, underground water resources, surface water systems. Those stories are prolific. There's a lot of byproducts, not just the fracking itself, but from the entire drilling process that cause serious environmental risk. And you mentioned that gas is cleaner, and it is when it's burned, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions about how much gas, both methane and the lengthier hydrocarbons like propane, hexane, how much they leak into the atmosphere when gas is drilled and when it's transported and when it's prepared for use. And the more we use gas, the more those leakage numbers add up and could also affect the climate equation.
David Baker, is it better than coal?
Well, the main thing that's still outstanding, I think, is what he started to mention about the leakage. I mean, that's potentially a huge problem. The reason that some people like the natural gas boom, who might not otherwise like it, is the fact that it has allowed us to start shifting away from coal. I mean, even before President Obama started talking about regulating emissions from coal plants, companies had stopped proposing new coal plants because natural gas was coming online so fast and was getting to be so cheap. And that's been a huge benefit in terms of trying to shave down our greenhouse gas emissions in the country. But if it turns out the leakage problem is worse than we realize, all those gains could be erased because methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I've seen some estimates saying it's about 20 times as powerful. So you don't have to have a lot of leakage in order for it to wipe out the whole climate benefit that we're hoping to get from natural gas.
Let's take a second here to just basically describe what fracking is. There's oil and gas wells. What happens? David Baker, just give us a real brief sort of the injection and what's going on.
The basic idea is that you drill a well down into a shale rock formation and you shove down into it a large amount of water mixed with a small amount of sand and chemicals. The chemicals are usually less than 5% of what you're shoving down. But you pump it all in there under very high pressure and it will crack the rocks down at the bottom. And that will, you create sort of a network of cracks that allows either oil or gas to escape from the rock and get to the well, and it'll come back up. We've had this technology around for a very long time, but what's happened recently that sort of revolutionized things is We've gotten better at combining it with horizontal drilling, which is drilling down and then basically taking a right turn when you get to the formation you like. And so instead of just fracking a little bit along the way, you're actually fracking a couple of miles of rock as you go. And that's the basic technique. There are tweaks on it that people have. But.
And ABRAHM, what's in the fracking fluid, this cocktail that goes down there to help get release those bubbles in the rock that come out as oil or gas? What's in the fluid?
Specifically, we don't know, and that's one of the key issues. Generally, it's a mixture of lubricants and things called surfactants and other materials that are meant to reduce friction when these substances are put into the well and increase the flow rate when it comes out and have all these sort of different effects. But as far as what the actual chemical makeup is, it's a bit of a mystery. The oil and gas industry protects its information as proprietary. They say that they're competitive trade secrets. They use the analogy of, Coke doesn't want to divulge its recipe to Pepsi. The federal government has accepted this so far as application to federal laws. It's exempted from parts of the law that would require disclosure. And the industry kind of ambles along this way and lets the debate unfold. And over the past couple of years, there has been a clamor of requests to understand what's being put underground. There have been a lot of really substantive steps towards increased disclosure. A couple of states are now requiring it, which is a really positive development. And the industry's developed a disclosure and quasi-transparency site that it calls Frac Focus, where they actually post all sorts of data about the wells that they drill, including what chemicals they put underground.
And ABRAHM LUSTGARTEN, you've done reporting a couple of years ago where you said there was 1,000 cases of documented water contamination, directly or indirectly, from fracking activity. Explain that.
Yeah, that's right. That was just a start. I think it was the first or one of the first stories that I'd done on this subject. And we just tried to get a quick measure in some of the drilling hotspots of how much of an issue water contamination was. So that's a figure that includes, that's groundwater contamination, but includes from all sorts of causes, including surface spills, perhaps from fracking underground, perhaps from leaking in the pipe mechanism itself. We basically combined figures that were available from state agencies in the majority of them, I think, for that number came from New Mexico and from Colorado, a handful from Ohio and Pennsylvania and so forth. New Mexico, for example, had just completed at that time a study finding that in 700 cases, the waste pits that hold used fracking fluids they were unlined in New Mexico at the time, and that they had leaked into and contaminated groundwater sources. Colorado state regulators, the State Oil and Gas Agency, has a really incredible dynamic data source on their website, and you can go in and search for whatever parameters you want, and one of them is groundwater contamination. So you can just run a query that selects natural gas wells. The state will say that 99% of the wells in the state are fracked. So natural gas wells with accidents or incidents that have happened underground and contaminated groundwater in some way. And that query contributed a couple thousand results last time I'd looked.
And what happens once water is contaminated? Then what? Can it be cleaned up? Who pays? Who's responsible?
Crickets.
Well, there's a lot of different ways to talk about water contamination, but to look at aquifer contamination, the prospect that a large body of water underground is polluted, generally can't be cleaned up, and historically shows that it's very, very difficult to do so. I'm thinking of a federal study from on a related issue of waste injection, but that goes back to the late 80s, that looked at the Government Accountability Office looked at, I think, 23 different incidents across the country of aquifer contamination, a lot from oil and gas, but from various industries. And you just go down the list of what was done, and one after one it says no remediation plan, too expensive. So generally doesn't happen.
ABRAHM LUSTGARTEN, you've written in Wyoming and Pennsylvania and Texas about the EPA backing off. So let's talk about Pavilion first in Wyoming, that case there, that story.
Yeah, sure. in Pavilion, Wyoming, is this little rural town about 150 miles east of Jackson Hole, or Jackson. And it's a real intensely drilled area for natural gas. Starting in the mid-1990s, residents there began complaining that their water was foul, that they're having trouble. One guy tells me that as a well across his field was fracked, his washing machine turned black and cloudy. Others complain of bad taste. I went there, we filled a stock well with water out of another gentleman's tap and took a torch to it, and the top lit on fire and melted.
Just like the movie.
Just like the movie. So they'd been complaining for years and years, and the state had investigated, not really found a whole lot of problems, and wasn't pursuing it aggressively. And in 2008, the EPA stepped in under the Superfund program to figure out what was wrong with the water there. This is a little bit pre-fracturing controversy, and this wasn't begun as an investigation into drilling per se, just environmental concerns. And over the couple of years that followed, they did dozens of water tests, and they found pretty concerning evidence to EPA scientists anyway that gas drilling was the cause, that there were probably multiple potential causes, but among them were wells that were fracked. They found trace levels of chemicals that are known to be used in hydraulic fracturing. They went through several layers of research, retesting, different phases, and the study became more and more controversial. And then the agency, having completed all of its research and just at the end of its public comment period and about to peer review its findings, abandoned the study. Backed out of it completely, said it will not finalize or certify its results, and it was turning it back over to the state of Wyoming.
And who's funding the study in the state of Wyoming?
The state of Wyoming is using a $1.5 million contribution from Encana, which is the Canadian oil and gas company that drilled the wells in Pavilion, Wyoming.
So when fracking is about to happen, do landowners need to be notified in advance that fracking will happen nearby, pre-notification, David Baker?
Right now, no. There is a bill pending in Sacramento regarding fracking. It does require a notification of surrounding property owners if you're going to frack a well. It's part of it sets up a specific permit that you would need to get in order to frack a well. And so you'd have to notify the people around you. The proposed regulations that the state is looking at outside of that bill would not exactly require notifying your neighbors. It would simply require posting a notice that would go on a state website a couple of days before the frack job would start. I think it's 3 days before the frack job would start. So you wouldn't have any specific warning that this was happening near you. You would just have to be very alert.
Until the trucks start rolling in. ABRAHM, LUSTGARTEN, a lot of landowners are becoming instant millionaires by leasing their rights to natural gas on their land.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, it's a mixed bag like every part of this conversation, but certainly energy development is something that can bring a lot of wealth to the places where it happens, and a lot of the energy development that we've seen in the last couple of years is in some of the poorest parts of the country.
Do some landowners have sort of lessor's remorse that they sell some leases and then have problems afterwards and go, oh, I wish I didn't do that, but then they're contractually obligated?
I talk to an enormous amount of people that have remorse of one form or another on this issue. Many for environmental reasons that we're talking about, but others just for financial reasons. They thought the payout would be bigger. They thought that the ratio of inconvenience or environmental impact or just disturbance to their property to payout would be different, that it would seem more worthwhile. There's a lot of people that kind of wish they could change the decisions that they made.
New York State, there's been a lot of fracking talk in New York State. There's currently a ban there. Let's talk about Governor Cuomo and where the status of fracking is in New York State. ABRAHM, LUSTGARTEN.
Governor Cuomo is procrastinating. And
he's running for president. That's what he's saying.
Well, I think that a quick course in the background there is actually kind of interesting. New York was poised to plow ahead with drilling in the Marcellus Shale. They kind of turned on a dime and stopped all development in 2008 and ordered a new environmental impact study, which is a pretty big deal in New York State. The idea was that that would go on for a year and a half. It'd answer some of these questions and then probably proceed with drilling, but maybe in a measured way or with certain precautions taken. And what happened since then, is, well, several things. I mean, the issue became a huge national controversy. A lot of the opposition to drilling is in New York State, a lot of the environmental voice behind this issue. Cuomo came into office. He wasn't at the beginning of this issue. And he's kind of in a bind. It's potentially very unpopular to a Democrat to be pro-energy and anti-environment. And it's potentially lethal to any politician in the United States to be anti-energy. Take that on top of the opportunities that we discussed about gas being potentially cleaner in certain ways. It's just a very sticky situation, and my read is that he intends to finish his term as governor without taking any stance on the issue.
Let's talk about how fracking can compete with agriculture and other people who want to use water. David Baker, I mean, there is an ag versus oil scuffle over water in California.
It's popped up in other states more than it has here. Colorado's sort of the poster boy for that. You've seen it also happening in Texas. And yeah, I mean, if you get into a competition of bidding, oil companies are going to win. They can outbid ranchers and farmers pretty much any day. The formations that we've got here are very heavily loaded with briny, brackish water that it's not drinkable, but it's locked in the rocks with the oil. And as a result of that, you don't actually have to pump as much water and chemicals and sand down into a fracked well in order to crack those rocks. You don't have to add as much to get the pressure that you want.
ABRAHM, let's talk about that in other places, your experience on sort of the competition for water supply.
Yeah, I usually talk about Texas when this question comes up because I think it's the most interesting example of a water starved area that is, from a policy standpoint and industry standpoint, plowing into the drilling opportunities just headlong. Texas is experiencing, has multi-year, experiencing one of the worst droughts on record. It has serious water demands that aren't being met. It's going to extraordinary measures to find those water resources in a lot of different ways, whether it's drilling for new aquifers or taking a dispute with neighboring Oklahoma to the Supreme Court of the United States over water rights, or looking at exotic plans to pipe water in from elsewhere. And at the same time, Texas has tens of thousands of these horizontal wells, which use up to 10 million gallons of water apiece, and can be fracked 4 to 8 times. There's a real contradiction, and the water that they're using for the fracking, unlike a lot of other industrial processes, is for the most part removed from the water cycle. There's some efforts to explore recycling, but for the most part, the wastewater, to the extent that it comes out of the well, if it does at all, is just pumped back down into a well where the expectation is that we'll never see it or touch it again. And there are similar tensions, whether it's in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Texas, and I think there will be in California to some degree.
Let's talk about internationally. Is this something that's happening just in the United States, or is fracking happening overseas as well?
Well, there are definitely companies that are looking at it overseas. Chevron, in our backyard here, is moving aggressively to look at this in Eastern Europe and also down in Argentina. But so far, we're ground zero for this.
Is this something that we can export, an export industry for the United States?
The industry hopes so. The technology that's made this possible is largely American-based. Halliburton and other American companies. Schlumberger is a French company that does a lot of the fracking, but it's their U.S. operations still where this has evolved. So the question in a lot of places where they want to drill aggressively, like Eastern Europe or South Africa or places like that, is how do you get the infrastructure and the technology that we have here, there. And so far that's proven to be extremely expensive or impractical. So that seems to be the holdup.
Let's go to audience questions. Welcome to Climate One.
Thank you. This is a really good, really good discussion, but I'm a native Californian, And the one thing I haven't heard you talk about is earthquake risk, although I've read about that in the East. Can you address that issue? Thank you.
David Baker, can hydraulic fracturing cause earthquakes?
Hydraulic fracturing almost always causes at least a tiny quake because you are, after all, breaking rocks underground. The fracking itself, most of the time, does not produce quakes that you can feel on the surface, although sometimes it does. The largest one that I know of that has been directly tied to fracking was about a 3.6 up in British Columbia. But here's the caveat. They do have to get rid of the water. They usually do it by a deep injection disposal well, which until recently was considered the environmentally friendly way to go about it. And those wells can and do cause seismicity. They do cause earthquakes. And we have a lot of them around the state, a lot of those wells. We haven't had people actually go out and really study this over the years, even though we've had those wells for decades. And I'm still kind of flabbergasted that some grad student or the USGS hasn't done this at some point, but we do have a lot of them. We're the perfect laboratory for it. We know this can happen. We've seen it happen in a bunch of places. So yeah, the fracking itself is not the problem, but disposing of the fracking water is.
Up ahead, we'll tap into the growing popularity of fracking in the U.S. TJ Glouthier, set the stage for us in terms of how much fracking is going on. This is something that's new to a lot of people, in terms of its impact and scale. How much fracking is for natural gas really is going on right now?
I'm not sure the exact number of wells, but it's something like 60% or more of the oil and gas now in the country is being produced with the aid of fracking. So it's a large amount. It's tens of thousands of wells that have been fracked, and is a practice that is regulated at the state level. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, but
right.
That varies from state to state. But there's a lot of it, and it's a common practice now. I think it is probably 8 years ago or so that it became more frequently used. So it's really been the last 5 years that we've had this huge explosion of gas availability and gas prices that have gone down to such low levels.
Mark Zoback, can you help us with the scale and sense of how much of this is going on and its impact on the energy supply?
Well, right now there are about 20,000 wells a year that are drilled horizontally and then hydraulically fractured. Each well has between about 5 and 15 hydraulic fractures on average. So there's 20,000 wells, roughly 200,000 hydraulic fractures carried out every year. There are 150,000 or so shale gas wells that are out there currently producing.
And what's been the market impact of this new technology?
Well, it's been remarkable. The local benefit to state economies, whether it's jobs or tax revenues. At the national scale, people are talking about a manufacturing renaissance in the Midwest. I guess we'll see if that comes about. American consumers are paying 1/3 for natural gas what they were paying, before the large-scale production of shale gas. And on the other side of the coin, CO2 emissions from coal are down 20% in just the last few years. And all of the other, pollution problems, health problems associated with coal are also diminishing thanks to the increased use of natural gas. So there are many, positive benefits, but there are also environmental impacts, and that's what we're here to discuss tonight.
Kassie Siegel, do you agree that natural gas is better than coal in terms of health impacts and climate impacts?
I don't. The fracking boom has transformed our energy economy, but I think it's come at an unacceptable price. And the fact is that fracking poisons our air and our water. It brings terribly intense industrial development to previously peaceful communities. The nature of shale development is that you have to drill lots and lots of wells. And to keep up production, you have to keep drilling more wells. It's conventional development on steroids. And sometimes fracking is promoted based on the argument that natural gas is a climate-friendly fuel. But it's not, and it's actually been called into question whether even burning natural gas in a power plant is better than burning coal if the methane leakage rate during production and transmission is higher than about 3%, then the actual life cycle carbon impact of burning natural gas is actually worse than coal. So it's not a bridge to a clean energy future. It's actually a bridge to extreme climate disruption, because the fact is that we have to leave the great majority of fossil fuel reserves in the ground today. That's global warming's new math. And we're running out of time to solve the problem, coming off the warmest year on record. Frankenstorm Sandy epitomizes the increasing damages we're facing from the climate crisis. And fracking promises us 100 years of natural gas, but we can't burn that natural gas. We have to transition as rapidly as possible to a clean energy future, and I think we should do that without fracking and without trashing our air and water and our health to get at extreme and unconventional fossil fuels, but instead make the renewable energy transition.
So TJ Glouthier,
I disagree with that.
I was thinking you would, yes.
Okay. I think that natural gas has a very important role to play in our conversion to a cleaner economy and a cleaner future. I don't think that it is at all worse than coal. I think coal is something that we've depended upon for 150 years. It's had a role that's been important, but it is extremely dirty and dangerous, all sorts of problems that we are moving away from. And we're doing it naturally. The economics of gas are actually doing that. And so we are using less coal, more gas, and what we ought to do is focus on how we make this transition in an effective way so that we can get more and more renewable energy, more conservation, get more out of the energy that we are using. And I think the issue with gas and fracking is that we need to regulate it well.
Mark Zoback, do we really know? You mentioned a number of thousands of wells. Are those wells being monitored, and how much methane is being escaped during the use of those wells?
Well, they're not being monitored adequately, and this is a really important question, and a lot more work has to be done. In every single case that's been investigated, it's a poorly constructed well that's caused the problem, and we know how to do that better. So really, it's completely unrelated to hydraulic fracturing. It is related to shale gas development. And one would say if the leakage is occurring, and therefore it's bad. It is bad and needs to be stopped. But the way to stop it is to do a better job of having, better standards, better enforcement, better regulations, and better enforcement of the regulations of how the wells are constructed, and then to follow that up with monitoring. So identify what the problem is, and then go out and solve it. The problem is not actually the hydraulic fracturing.
Kassie Siegel, do you agree this is a problem that can be solved, that the methane can be contained, and if that happens, then gas will be better than coal?
Methane from oil and gas can absolutely be reduced, and we need to do it. We're not going to turn off the switch on fossil fuels tomorrow. There will be some fossil fuel use in the next few decades as we transition. And everybody's known that controlling methane from oil and gas is a critical thing to do. That's not new. The EPA put out a big report on short-lived climate forcers in 2006, talking about the readily available, cost-effective, and even cost-positive measures to capture methane from oil and gas wells. Absolutely. But the thing is, it's often natural gas, if you captured all the methane, is often compared as if we did capture all the methane to other impacts. But the fact is that we're not. We're not doing it. We're not reducing other air pollutants.
So do you think there ought to be a moratorium, a ban right now, sort of a pause, or how should the U.S. proceed and states proceed with this that's happening, sounds very quickly, the last 5 years, thousands of wells?
I absolutely think we should have a ban on fracking. I mean, I and many others are also working for an end to burning coal to protect the Arctic from drilling, and for no Canadian tar sands and no Keystone Pipeline. But I think no fracking is a big part of a really sensible energy policy going forward.
Mark Zoback, ProPublica reported a couple years ago that there have been 1,000 incidents documented in Colorado, New Mexico, Alabama, Ohio, and Pennsylvania of groundwater contamination. So there's already a lot of damage out there. I want your comment on that, and then also what to do about water management.
Well, and that comes back to the leaking well, the poorly constructed leaking well problem. It's not the hydraulic fracturing problem, and it has to be addressed. And let me just back up and cover something. When our Secretary of Energy Committee looked at the shale gas development issue, we were unanimous in affirming that shale gas can be developed in an environmentally responsible manner. But we also pointed to 20 different areas where things had to be done better. And, we've identified the problems and recommended solutions. And so, switching to natural gas is not a get-out-of-jail card. We have to proceed responsibly or we obviate the benefits. We totally agree. And, if gas is going to be a transition fuel, well, or a bridge, a blue bridge to a green future, there's got to be something on the other side of that bridge, and that's got to be renewables. And so I think there's a lot we agree about. The real question is how we transition from where we are to where we're going, and whether or not natural gas, is going to play a role in that transition, and there's no reason, why it cannot. Now, the issue with water is just part of one of these, 20 issues. In some parts of the country, there's a lot of concern about the water that's being used for hydraulic fracturing, but it really is only like a 1 or 2% increase in water use in that area. So it's a large-scale industrial process. There are lots of problems, but if you identify the problems, you can also identify solutions to those problems, and you can move forward in a responsible way.
And what are the consequences for the problems if someone is fracking, a company is fracking, and groundwater gets contaminated, as there's alleged 1,000 incidents? What's the recourse for communities? What's the penalty, TJ Glauthier, for a fracker contaminating groundwater? What's the recourse?
Well, there should be total accountability and responsibility. I'm not sure the difference state to state.
Because there's a federal, in 2004, the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's the famous Halliburton loophole that exempts fracking from that process. Should that be closed?
Yes, I think that the Safe Drinking Water Act ought to cover these kind of wells. And I don't know if everybody's aware of it, but this was an amendment passed in 2005 that exempted oil and gas wells, and it was labeled the Halliburton loophole because a vice president at the time had something to do with Halliburton, and there was a sense that there was, came from the Energy Policy Committee that he had.
But also the EPA at that point had said, Kassie, that fracking was not a problem, right?
Well, they did a report in 2004, and they looked only at fracking for coal bed methane, and that report has been totally discredited. They said, oh, it's fine, no problem, or at least it was spun that way, and that after that report came out, then we got the Halliburton loophole. But the EPA now admits that we don't even know all the risks from fracking to water, and they're studying that in a very major process. It's been going on since 2010, and we won't have any results from that until 2014. But while they're doing that, fracking is going on around the country, uncontrolled or very, very lightly regulated, and the consequences are really, really serious. They were serious for a rancher named Ned Prather in Colorado, who turned on his tap one day and drank a glass of water that had benzene in it at 20 times the limit that EPA considers acceptable. His throat started burning. He got dizzy. He was immediately taken to the hospital. He didn't die, but it was serious, and that's a very, very rare instance where that driller was actually fined.
Mark Zobak, where is this regulated well? Kassie talked about Colorado. Colorado has since passed is what some people might call some of the more aggressive oversight regulations of fracking. Is it Colorado, or where else do you think the regulation is going well?
Well, Pennsylvania sort of stepped up when activity began there, and the then Secretary of Environmental Protection, John Hanger, hired, I think it was 90 new regulators and trained them and put them in the field and put them right to work. So there are states that are, responding to the need for better regulation. I want to address one point that Kassie raised, and these instances are really heartbreaking and regrettable, and finding out what happened in each and every case is important. But when you look at the data, we have a lot of experience. If you look at the Barnett Shale in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there's 16,000 wells. The study of those 16,000 wells by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab in Boulder, Colorado, a DOE lab, says that the methane emissions are no worse than the well, let's just put it this way. The total greenhouse gas footprint is half the amount of burning coal. So are there methane emissions? Yes. NREL points to fugitive emissions and points to methods to reduce them even more. But the net effect is that using gas from the Barnett Shale produces half as much impact on the climate as burning, on burning coal. 16,000 wells, and there have been reports of cancer hotspots, all of which have not proven to be valid once they're looked at carefully. And there are no reported cases of widespread aquifer contamination.
Let's have our audience questions. Welcome to Climate One.
Thanks very much. My name is Brent Plater. I just have a question. I was really interested to see the panelists acknowledge some of the constraints of regulation for fracking, whether it's regulation, the problems with some of the agency corruption, financing it, finding a way to fund it. And yet there was still, for some of the panelists anyways, this kind of almost reflexive objection to a ban as an alternative regulatory strategy. And so I was wondering if perhaps you could provide us with some examples of some bans that have been effective or implement best practices, or maybe at the very least, just tell us what your bottom line would be to support a ban. What would it take for you to be in favor of a ban as opposed to a regulation type strategy?
Mark Zobak, can you envision a scenario where a pause or a timeout would be appropriate to let policy catch up with technology and say, look, this thing's going ahead so fast, we got to hit the brakes for a while to get it right before some bad mistakes happen?
Well, I think that's actually already happening due to the low gas price. But I think the right thing to do is for public interest groups to make sure the government is, through the regulatory process, is only allowing development to go forward at a pace commensurate with its ability to regulate what's happening. And that's what should be done. We shouldn't open the doors to to development. It should be occurring at the appropriate pace, that it's being regulated properly. We're not relying on self-enforcement. We're not relying on old and inadequate regulations. We're doing sufficient regional planning. A lot of wells are being drilled, and we have to look at the regional impact on communities, ecosystems, infrastructure to do it right. And so I think in each and every state, the challenge is for the development to occur at a constructive pace, at a pace where you're not doing more harm than good. And that, if you want to call that a pause, I would just simply say, you slow down to adapt to local road conditions, and don't go any faster, or accidents will happen.
I want to finish on a reference to a couple of movies that helped really frame the debate around fracking. Mark Zobak, did you see Gasland?
I did.
And did you give it thumbs up or thumbs down?
All 10 digits down. It's one thing to point to these important issues of the environmental impact of shale gas development. It's another to misrepresent the issue so dramatically. And that was my problem with Gasland. The burning faucet had nothing to do with shale gas development, had nothing to do with fracking. 2 years earlier, it was identified that individual had drilled a water well into an area with what's called biogenic methane that's just naturally occurring. And it was just done for sensationalism.
Kassie Siegel, was Gasland sensationalistic and distorting?
I think Gasland is one of the most important movies of our time. I think it's galvanizing a movement, and I don't think that Josh Fox misrepresented anything. He started covering an issue when he was approached by a gas company wanting to pay him $100,000 for the rights to his property, and I think he did an incredible job investigating that issue, telling people stories, and letting people know what was going on. And the thing with methane, here we are in the richest, most scientifically advanced country in the world, and we're still not capturing methane, even though it's easy and cheap to do. And in Pennsylvania, there was methane contamination of those wells. Maybe some of it's biogenic, but there's also studies that show that the methane was associated with oil and gas. So very, very, very important movie, and we just need to keep building the movement, because this movement against fossil fuels is part of what's going to get us to a rational energy policy, and it's going to get us to the greenhouse gas reductions that are just scientifically required in the next couple decades. We need to start decarbonizing in the next couple decades. Lots of people here have probably been to lots of fabulous talks here by top scientists about the urgent nature of the problem and what we have to do. Those are big changes, and this movement against fracking is going to help get us there.
TJ Glouthier, last word on the urgency of decarbonizing the economy.
Well, I think that part of what Kassie just said is the next couple of decades we need to be making changes. We need to actually manage this process so that the next couple of decades don't create even more problems. So I think the regulation, the transparency, the other things that are needed have to be done, and we do have to continue to work out all the other ways of really making this energy sustainable and appropriate.
Up next, we'll dig into what fracking means for Californians. Steve Craig, let's begin with you, and I want to ask you briefly how you came to be involved with fracking, or how fracking became involved with you.
Fracking came to us in Monterey County really rather suddenly, and we began to see it in two ways. The first way was people began to come to me because of my background in land planning, asking about what a mineral split estate was and how come the oil company that owned the mineral estate could eject them from the surface of the land. And it was immediately piqued by the issue. The second thing that happened is a fracking well went up about 15 miles from our ranch, right on the Salinas River, lacking any of the protections that even our wineries were required to have in place. So it was firsthand from angry people looking for an explanation for what was happening to their surface rights, and a fracking well, which is a 24-hour-a-day, all night long, bright, noisy operation, which out in the country upsets people.
Dave Quast, tell us how you came to be involved with the energy industry and drilling and fracking.
Well, I've been working with the energy industry and other industrial industries for a number of years as a consultant, and recently started working with, a couple years ago, started working with California with Energy in Depth, which really is an education and research organization just trying to make sure that the facts about hydraulic fracturing, which has been so much in the public consciousness and has generated so much concern, are out there.
Okay. Bill Aliode, 10 years ago, environmentalists probably didn't even know about fracking. It's come on very quickly, very strong across California and the United States. An environmental working group. Tell us how you came to regard fracking as a serious issue.
Sure. I'm stationed in Sacramento doing the working on flame retardants, BPA, and baby bottles. But our staff back east was kind of ground zero for fracking, working on Pennsylvania, New York. When I saw the movie Gasland, I said, light bulb, are we doing that in California? I haven't heard of it. So I went where any citizen would go. I went to the Division of Oil and Gas's website, a public agency, to see what do they say about this. I couldn't find anything really. So I met with them and said, I got this paper here that says there's interest in fracking for gas in the Sacramento Delta area. This was Occidental Petroleum. And they told me that's hype from the oil companies. Don't believe it. We don't need to frack for gas because it's too cheap, it's too readily accessible. But Environmental Working Group dug deeper, and within weeks we found out we've been fracking for oil in California since 1953, Los Angeles, that most wells in Kern County were being fracked. New wells were being fracked in Monterey County and Ventura, Santa Barbara, offshore, and fracking for oil. That was the difference. So we went to a kind of a struggle with the Division of Oil and Gas about why they were denying this, and this went on for a year. But we developed legislation and started moving it through the legislature, and that's when things really started opening up in California, and the public got involved, legislators got involved, and eventually we got our state regulatory agencies to say, yes, we frack here and we want to do something about it.
Mark Nuckadam, you came to the agency at a time when, well, tell us how you came to the agency and a little bit of background about your entry into this.
Sure. Well, I was minding my business as a federal climate scientist in Washington, D.C., and actually a senior advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture on climate and working on the federal climate bills. And the Department of Conservation began having some real trouble with the permitting process. And that's when the governor...
They were trying to slow it down.
They were trying to do some things that really need to be looked at very carefully, but kind of all at once. And the governor became quite dissatisfied with them, and as we say in the business, thanked them for their service, and called me in Washington and asked if I would be interested in leading the department into a more kind of responsible and time series, time step work on oil and gas.
Let's step back and look at the big picture here. I mean, potentially California has half as much oil as the North Slope in Alaska. So here, that's a pretty big change to think about California as a major oil producer and presumably an exporter, unless we're going to burn all that oil in state. Dave Quast, that's a fundamental change for California as a major petroleum state.
Well, it is, and we've been a major petroleum state for a number of years, and the governor's indicated strongly that we want to continue to do that. And the way to get oil out of deep shale formations, for example, in a lot of cases is hydraulic fracturing. But you touched on something earlier. I mean, California, because of its geology, hydraulic fracturing isn't used here on the percentage of wells, even close to it, as it is in the East Coast. But there are a lot of things that make California a bit different. So, hydraulic fracturing is definitely, as Mark said, it's a 1 or 2 day thing that happens in the life of a well, but it is an important part of the life of some wells. And it's been done safely. It'll continue to be done safely in a more regulated environment now. And we should all be excited about that, given the potential economic benefits and environmental benefits of developing our oil onshore.
Are you saying that onshore oil is better than offshore oil? Is that what
I'm saying that onshore oil, developing it under a very highly regulated regime, is much preferable to importing it from Venezuela and from places that don't have environmental protections. Yes.
Bill Elliott, California has been a leader in climate policy, trying to decarbonize the economy and promote renewable fuels. And here we have the prospect of California being a major petroleum state. Help us understand that. Is California schizophrenic in that regard, or is that going to undermine California's climate leadership?
We're concerned when you inject water under pressure with toxic chemicals, with threats of above ground spills, well casing failures that could pollute groundwater, all that. You don't just say, it's a well stimulation technique. We trust the industry to regulate themselves. No, bad idea. That's why we pushed DOGGR and using the legislature to do that, to do something about it.
DOGGR is the Department of Oil and Gas Resources?
I use the acronym, Division of Oil and Gas. To do something about it. Now, on energy policy, the all the above is sort of what Jerry Brown's doing, although he's not a proponent of nuclear power for sure. And as is President Obama, we think that that's a mistake. I was around in 1973 and 79 when the Arab oil embargoes took place, and my 1980-something Honda Accord got better miles per gallon than today's Honda Accord. So why is this? Why did the U.S. sit on their hands for 40 years when we knew oil from the Middle East could be cut off and the CAFE or the fuel efficiency standards were barely bumped up over this 40 years? I think that's not the way to go. And also, utilities are blocking distributed generation, which is basically solar on everyone's roof. Why are they against that? Why aren't we pushing that and energy conservation all the way before we start trying to get every last hydrocarbon out of the ground in California or any other state?
Mark Nekadem, let's get you on there's this potential tremendous resource in California that could be exploited, yet it has tremendous carbon consequences.
It is true.
You're a climate scientist, after all, so.
And I worry about that very much. But from the perspective of what the resource is, California has long been the fourth largest. It was for a long time the third largest oil-producing state in the country. It's something that most Californians don't know. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that most Californians don't know is because the industry actually does operate in a very constrained environment, highly regulated, and you don't hear a lot about major accidents or spills, et cetera. And it's not because people are covering it up, it's simply because it's a highly regulated industry, and our department does have a number of engineers on the ground 24/7. 365 days a year. So it is a tremendous resource. I think one of the fundamental fears, and everybody talks about the Monterey Shale, which is not in Monterey, by the way, but the big concern is there's 15 billion barrels of oil down there if we can just get at it, and we're going to turn the entire Central Valley all the way to LA into something like Williston, North Dakota. And that really is a land use and development choice that California has all of the tools and all of the ability to protect farmland, to protect urban development, to do land use decision making at the local level. It is not necessarily, or certainly my department doesn't control land use decisions, but I think California needs to think very carefully about what are the potential impacts from another boom, which California is very famous for its booms.
Steve Craig, you've lived this.
Hey, I've got to give some pushback to that. with all due respect, what we have learned is that the Halliburton loophole has basically opened this huge gap.
Explain what that is.
The Halliburton loophole is an exclusion for fracking technology, whether it's acid injection, chemical injection, or any other injection. And incidentally, those injections occur at 8,000 psi at the surface of the wellhead. It excludes it from the Safe Water Drinking Act. Dogger is only responsible from the wellhead down. So all of the process that occurs outside that context, the trucking in, the damage to the transportation index of the roads from the heavy materials, the storage of chemicals, the complete absence of any kind of surrounding protection in case there's a spill right on the river. We called the local regional board in San Luis Obispo, and the answer we got is a very interesting one. Well, you know, the Safe Water Drinking Act loophole has really created a problem for us. We don't really know whether we can act because it sort of overlaps with the Clean Water Act, and all I can say is, you know, farmers are generally short-tempered about a lot of things, particularly water. And when something takes 1 million gallons per frac, and you've got 3 wells on a pad, it upsets people. And there was no regulation anywhere. We couldn't find it.
Dave Quast?
Yeah, could I just speak to the water use issue really quickly? Because this is another area, much like the geology issue, where it's much different in California. There are frac jobs in the east that take millions of gallons of water. The Western States Petroleum Association has said that in California, the average fracture of a well takes 116,000 gallons. Now, to put that in perspective, an average golf course in California uses 320,000 a day. So all of the hydraulic fracturing that happened in 2012 across the whole state used 202 acre-feet of water, as opposed to 27 million acre-feet in the agriculture industry. So it's a blip, and it's another reason it's very different here. And so the water issues and the other issues that we're going to face, seismicity, things like that, you know, we have to look at from a California-centric perspective, and we have to figure out what makes sense for California as we do these regulations.
Especially in a climate era where there's projections for less fresh water in the state, declining Sierra snowpack, there already isn't enough water. What's the wisdom of entering further into a water-intensive energy posture?
The question of water policy, I think, is a very important political question for California. What I'm a little bit nervous about is that the Department of Conservation and the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources is being held accountable for a whole bunch of things that are not in our jurisdiction. And I absolutely forbade my staff in my department when I got here from saying it's not my job, because we are public servants. So if it's not our job is to figure out, Steve, what happened there that you couldn't get good government to respond. And that to me is a deep concern. I get very, very concerned when the public feels like we are somehow ignoring them or blowing off their concerns. We should be paying attention. We are public servants.
But I think
Steve Craig,
the way to clarify that is to eliminate this loophole. I think it's important that the regulators, and you are, I guess, our chief regulator for this issue, understand the need to close that loophole and to return the Safe Water Drinking Act, Clean Water Act, and all other standards to make them operable again. I mean, as a person who is entirely reliant now for my living on clean water, it is critical. And, you know, when you mention the re-injection of 60% of what comes back in is re-injected water that is full of chemicals that no one has to disclose, not to you, not to any of us. And I get irritated, as you can probably tell, when we're put in the position as members of the public to carry the burden of trying to force regulators to ask the right questions. And at this point, we don't know what's in fracking fluid still. We have some idea. And yet people, some of whom we heard earlier, say fracking no problem. How can you even know if it's a problem if you don't even know the contents of the chemistry? And, you know, I'm not a scientist anymore. But science, I know, is a search for truth. And that means you disclose. And if you undertake an industry that affects the public commons to hide behind the trade secret, which is for chocolate bonbons and special ways to make good champagne, it's just wrong. It's not fair to the public to hide behind that trade secret veil and expect us to live with it.
Mark Nicodem, can there be more transparency in terms of, there's already a lot of disclosure going on. How about the fracking fluids?
Oh, absolutely. Both as a citizen and as a regulator, it seems to me that as much transparency as possible across, not just in the oil and gas industry. Most people don't know where their water comes from. Most people don't know where their milk comes from. Most people don't know where their gasoline comes from. I think it's terribly important, and fracking happens to be the fulcrum point right now by which a lot of people are learning way more than they ever expected to know about how oil and gas is produced in California or elsewhere. I think that's terribly valuable. And for me, as a regulator, it makes total sense to have complete disclosure as long as we are respecting the intellectual property rights of those who are trying to competitively operate in the industry.
I want to come back to water, and then we're going to go to audience questions. Is this going to compete with other uses of water in the state?
On freshwater use, it's a huge concern. We're entering a 5th out of 6 years of drought in California. In about 1300 AD, we had a 120 or 140-year drought. Who's to say that couldn't happen again? I urge the listeners and viewers of the Commonwealth Club presentation here to look at a story in the High Country News from about 2.5 years ago called Oil and Water Don't Mix in Kern County. And it was done by a freelance reporter, and it talked about how water in the droughts get cut back to the residential users. Don't flush your toilet, pay more for the water. The farmers were cut back, but the water kept flowing to the oil companies, and how much they were using, unknown. They have to report what Mr. Nicodem said, how much they pull out of the ground and produce and reinject. But how much they're taking from the State Water Project, from the Kern County water agencies, we don't know, because they'll say it's intellectual property, that's competitive business. We don't want our, Occidental doesn't want Chevron to know. We think in this water-poor state at times, like we are now, that everyone ought to know. If I'm being cut back in my house, shouldn't Chevron be cut back in Kern County?
Let's have our audience question. Welcome to Climate One.
Hi, thanks for giving up your time. Howard Fallon. With the globalization of the world's economy, we're looking at the failure of nation states, basically. The corporations don't pay tax anymore. Apple pays nothing. They move all the money offshore. And as a part of the parcel of that, they've captured these regulatory agencies. So all this talk about regulation, how is that going to happen? We have failed. These corporations own this place. They're running the show. They're the owners now.
Bill Elliott?
That's a good point, and let's not forget these are the most powerful corporations in the world. Just the last 2 quarters of the last year, Exxon and Chevron reported profits, not revenue, between $7 to $10 billion per quarter. So they're big, they're powerful, they're making a lot of money, they're invested all over the world. But our concern here in California is the state agency up to the regulatory job. We maintain they've been a little too cozy with the industry all these years. They weren't getting scrutiny from environmental groups. They basically worked in the field with Chevron, Occidental for 80, 90 years, and suddenly it's a new ballgame for them. And we have new leadership there. I think he welcomes the scrutiny and is trying to do something about it. But we have some level of distrust as to whether they're up to the task. So we're pushing harder to get better regulations out of them and to end the relationship that they've had and start to say, we put the public first, not Chevron first, and who we work for.
Next question. Welcome to Climate One.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I just wanted to ask, we've been talking a lot about water quality, but I wanted to ask about air quality. Unfortunately, Los Angeles is the poster child for never being able to meet the national ambient air quality standards. And there's been case studies about how in Wyoming and Montana, places that have been heavily hit by the fracking boom, their air quality is worse than Los Angeles on smoggy days. And so talking about possibly fracking in the Central Valley where we already struggle with air quality, I wanted to see if the fracking boom would have a significant impact on the air quality in California and how that would basically affect the economics as well, because health problems are very costly.
Who'd like to tackle air quality?
I'll do a start here. One of the saddest days of my life was going to the Wind River Range in central Wyoming and seeing the gas wells there. And the level of ozone is right. The question is right. It's this higher than Los Angeles. It's one of my special places to go visit in the world. And it's hard for me to go back there now to see the air pollution caused by hydraulic fracturing of wells, gas wells. If there's a fracking boom, if the Monterey Shale plays out, if the oil companies are able to get into this formation in great quantity, it's a big concern. Just because when you drill a well, there's diesel emissions, could be leaks, truck traffic to and from. So we need to take that into account. We can't just go blindly. We need the energy. We have to go forward. There's jobs involved. Air quality. We spent a lot of money and time. We all drive cleaner cars to clean up our air. It'd be terrible to go backwards.
Steve Craig.
Just the one thing to add, and it's probably not going to make you feel very well, and that is, as citizens, you have to work very hard with your local governments and your local air quality management districts, come to hearings, write letters of appeal. Unfortunately, there isn't a state agency that is actively involved in above the ground wellhead issues about tracking point source emissions. It's done on a AQMD basis. So participate in your California Environmental Quality Act process for new developments. Keep your eyes out if you are a resident of a rural area, because they are coming. And the only people that can stop them, really, truly, are the people themselves. And the law is there to insist on good point source regulation, good scrubbers on any fugitive emissions. So it's a lot of work, but it's important work, and you're a good citizen if you do it.
Let's hear from Dave Quast with the energy industry.
Well, on that, all I would say is I'm a parent in Los Angeles of 4 kids, so I care a lot about the air quality, at least down there. And this is among the environmental issues that people are talking about: air quality, water quality, reduced seismicity, things like that. And Dogger, I think it's safe to say, is working with other regulators to ensure that whatever we do end up with is comprehensive and it's robust, and that it covers all of the concerns that citizens have, as long as it's based on sound science. And that's what we care about.